Welcome back, my friends. I'm old Dr. D, and this is part 3 of our series on mental health and relationships. So pull up a chair. Let's hang out for a minute. Where we left off last time was on the concept of transformative relationships. Transformative relationships are characterized by, and this is according to Robertson's work, characterized by compassion, engagement, presence, authenticity, and how respect manifests, an appreciation for power and how power works. So continue with that theme. How do we live compassion? What does compassion mean? One of the things you may have heard me talk about before is a surprising finding from my years working in prisons. Some of the most empathic people I met in terms of understanding and feeling what other people feel were some of the sex offenders that I worked with. In fact, those of the serial variety, meaning that they had multiple victims, that they very much understood and had a co-feeling with their victims. That's what charged them and got them off. And so I've really rethought what empathy means since I had those experiences where these men would, in sometimes gory detail, share what my kids call nightmare fuel stories with me about their perpetuation of their crimes. It was pretty horrific stuff. And they often had, not always, but often had a pretty deep awareness of what their victims were experiencing. Now, don't get me wrong, there were other serial sex offenders who were in denial about it, that would talk about how it is that their victims felt other things very much differently than what their victims felt. But many got it, they understood. And so I kept thinking, okay, this isn't how we in psychology are intending to use the word empathy. We are presuming that when we use the word empathy, that it means a feeling with an other. Empathein is where the root comes from, like a feeling into an experience with another, or feeling into another's experience. From the Greek, that would lead to a change in behavior in terms of how we treat one another. So therefore, I'd like to introduce the notion that compassion is empathy with motivation to help. Okay? That compassion is a key part of transformative relationships. So compassion first entails understanding what somebody else is experiencing. And it can be very important for us to, ask. 100 years ago, I can remember one of my girlfriends calling me on the phone. I was 15 and she was distraught. And this is back in the corded telephone days. So I did what we teenagers did back then, and I took the corded phone and I pulled it into my bedroom, stretching it from the wall in the hallway where it was so I could talk to her with some illusion of privacy. And while I was talking to her, I did not know this, but my father upstairs needed to make a phone call. And so he picked up the phone, and I didn't hear the telltale click. He was very subtle about it, thinking that somebody else might be on the phone. And he listened for a couple of minutes to my phone call with this girlfriend of mine. And after the call was over, it was pretty late at night. It was after 11, and my father comes downstairs. And he knocks on my door, and I think, okay, we're going to fight. My father and I fought quite a bit when I was a teenager, but we didn't, far from it. In fact, he sat down at the foot of my bed, and I'm sitting there with my jaw set, ready to argue. And he talked about how he listened to just a little bit to realize who I was talking to and what the content was, and then he hung up the phone again. Apologized if he had disturbed our privacy, and then said, Matthew, it's what he called me, still calls me. He said, there are people who do what you do, and you've done your entire life, and they do it for a living. And they're called psychologists, he said. And so my father punted me down the path that I'm still on, very gently. I think punting is too violent a word, but very kindly just kind of launched me down this particular direction. And so as he began talking about compassion and about how compassion is something that is practiced, and he encouraged me to continue to practice it. A key part of compassion is wondering to ourselves what it is the other might be feeling. And then I would argue that another part of compassion can be, and especially in interpersonal communication, needs to be how the other person feels verified through words. So again, having been a psychologist for a long time, I don't presume I know what other people feel. I'm pretty good at seeing subtle signs on, especially around people's eyes, their skin tone changes when they have feelings, but I don't know what the specific feelings are. For example, just last week I was talking to a client, and as he was talking, I noticed that there was reddening around his eyelids, and I thought that might be indicative of tears. And so I just observed. I said, what you just said seems to have hit you with some feeling. And he's like, no. And so as we went on, sure enough, it was just, he was suffering from allergies, and I misread the situation. In other cases, though, it's been yes, and then sometimes they have a hard time articulating what it is that they're experiencing. But you ask, that's what you do. I can't tell you how many times I've been counseling couples, and there's this assumption amongst one or both that if the other really loved them, then they would just magically know what the other felt. And so that's one of the things that I need to dispel quite quickly for those couples is, as a therapist, I tend to ask how people are feeling. It's even a meme now. It's even like a stereotype, if not an absurd parody of therapy. Tell me, how do you feel about that, right? That's actually an earnest question because we as therapists don't often know, and the clients don't necessarily always know. So therefore, asking people how they feel becomes very important. And to be patient when people don't know, especially because feelings aren't necessarily easy categorizable, that we can be feeling multiple things all at once. And so it can take us a little bit of time to sort out. Like the other day, for example, I was talking to my sweetheart, and we had a rare disagreement. And as she was kind of sorting through, she goes, okay, well, I'm feeling frustrated about this. It took her a day for both of us to sort out our feelings with this particular disagreement. And she comes to me because I ask her, well, how do you feel? And she goes, I don't know, right? She needs time to sort it out. And so she's talking about how she felt frustrated in part, she felt sad in part, and kind of magnifying the sad, a little bit of grief and loss with this particular issue, as well as a little bit of anger with me because I was being stubborn on a particular point, right? And so sometimes it takes us a while to sort out what it is that we feel. And that takes practice. So for those of you who are living with people who have a hard time articulating their feelings, it takes practice. And so that's one of the things that we can endeavor to be patient with the people we love about. So we get to ask, right? How do you feel about this? And then we endeavor to exercise listening skills and active listening skills about what they say. And I don't know, I hate to break it to you, is a fair answer. Because sometimes people really don't feel much of anything, so it's hard to detect. And in other cases, it's very complex, and they don't know how to articulate it. Now, I would also like to feel that it can be somewhat gendered, because I've noticed that men disproportionately are likely to use I think phrases when you ask them how they feel, rather than actual emotional words. And so sometimes it's something I get to joke with my clients about is, I've asked you 3 times about your feeling, or I've reflected feeling back to you, and you respond to me with thoughts and logic. And between you and I, intellectualization is where we tend to turn our deeply held emotional feelings or issues into a logical problem, demonstrates what we call primitive trauma around emotional processing. So that's a fancy word or fancy phrase for at a young age, when boys have emotions and they are not allowed to articulate or experience their emotions, and instead they're taught, throw some mud on it, get back to work, or, quit crying or whatever else, then they turn their emotional problems into a matter of intellect. And intellect, surprisingly enough, can help us work through emotional problems. It can. It can also help block our processing of emotional problems. Trust me, as somebody who deeply intellectualizes, it's gotten in my way a lot, and that may be true for you. So it's disproportionately common for men, but I'm not going to say it's universally true for men. There are some men I know who are very deep and nuanced with their feeling, and there are some women I know who tend to intellectualize. Regardless, be aware when people are responding with I think phrases when it comes to feeling, right? Then that's a flag that it may be harder for them to get in touch with their emotions, and please endeavor patience with them. So endeavor to understand what somebody else feels. If you don't know, you can ask. Another is some people can actively use their imaginations. How would I feel in this particular situation? That can get you 9/10 of the way sometimes. It's like a metaphor that I use sometimes when I'm talking with folks, either clinically or colloquially, is if I were to walk a mile in their shoes, my feet would hurt because I've got really big feet and their feet are a lot smaller than mine. So just because I can put myself in their shoes doesn't mean their shoes fit. And so I still need some help understanding where they're coming from or what they mean when they say they feel a particular way. So compassion. Compassion is motivated empathy, right? That it's empathy plus motivation to help. Empathy, part 2, is understanding what somebody feels in order for us to have compassion, to be motivated to help. Another part of that is if you don't know, ask, and you can endeavor to put yourself in other people's shoes to imagine what they might feel like, but then you verify by asking them, oh, if I were in your shoes, here's how I would feel. How do you feel in that particular situation? Okay. So the other thing about compassion, this motivated sense of empathy, is helping people in their terms, right? To the best of your ability, if you think it fits. And I know that's very layered. There's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's the shoe problem again, right? My feet don't necessarily fit in their shoes. So what it is that I am asking of someone, and someone that if they were in the situation, what they would like done to them may not fit with me because our shoes aren't the same size, right? So if we're trying to empathize and have compassion for one another, the other is always already implicated in how it is that compassion is manifest and felt. I hope at some point we can have a video, and I'm sure we will, on virtuism, the moral assumption of virtuism. And so hopefully we'll talk about that in another video another day. So the other is a part of that. For example, there are times when my sweetheart is going through it and she needs me to be around and to be comforting and not to solve her problem. Just to be there, to rub her back, just to be present and close by and calm and loving, right? Whereas for me, when I'm suffering things, I need to process through it. I just need to get in the mud and scoop it up and chew my way through the problem until I found a way to live in that mud, right? And so if I approached her the way I prefer to be approached, there would be a disjunction there, right? And a miscommunication. So with compassion, do unto others as they need it done to them. And unfortunately, you got to ask. It gets back to thinking you know what other people are feeling. You don't. Very often, to 100% degree, right? You need to ask. It's like when I'm talking to students who would like to become a clinical psychologist or a marriage and family therapist or clinical social worker or clinical mental health counselor, somebody involved in the talking professions, in the talking help professions, thank you, is they'll say, oh, I'm too empathic. I couldn't possibly be a good therapist. I just really read people well. I really intuit what they're feeling, what they feel matters to me, and I resonate with that. I couldn't possibly be a therapist. And it's like, or maybe it's you would be an excellent therapist, and what you get to practice are how to navigate and negotiate other people's feelings. So empathy is one thing. Compassion is empathy motivated to help. Now, there are 3 levels of empathy. Thank you. 3 levels of compassion. And that's sacrifice, generosity, and kindness. So sacrifice is the altruistic part of compassion. And that is, I will need to provide for the other to meet their needs in a way that costs me something that I need as well. That's sacrifice. So you're in a hurry at work and there's an issue in front of you and traffic, etc., and you get out to help. Helping is going to make you later, but other people are also suffering, so you do that. You run extra late, you're in a little bit of trouble at work, and you're able to help people. That's sacrifice. There was a story that one of my old professors taught me back in graduate school. It's a very interesting story. It's about behavior of students at the Yale Seminary. What his colleagues at Yale had done is set up an experiment with 3 levels. They told their seminarians, so these are students who are getting graduate degrees in seminary studies. They're going to be pastors or priests, etc. They're going to run their own congregations in their respective denominations. I think exclusively Protestant, but I'm not sure. And so the scenario was this, the experiment was this. So they talked to the seminarians, all these graduate students in seminary, and they said, okay, we have a whole group of new students coming into the seminary right now. We need one of you to go and give a lecture on the Good Samaritan to these students. And so they selected those volunteers. And there were 3 conditions, and the seminarians in each condition didn't know about the other conditions. They also didn't know that there was a confederate involved. A confederate is somebody who's in on the study, who's like an actor who helps with the condition of the study. Okay, so the 3 conditions were this. One is the seminarian had like 10 minutes to race across this big campus and give the lecture on the Good Samaritan. Number 2, they had 20 minutes. If they hoofed it, they could make it. They didn't need to run. And then the last condition, they had 45 minutes in order to get there, which was plenty of time. And so, again, the story of the Good Samaritan, for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, and I'm not going to do it justice. This will be in a later video when we start talking about mental health and religion. For now, though, an inadequate summary is a person is going down the road from A to B and encounters somebody who had been mugged and left for dead on the side of the road, and several people pass the poor victim by, and one of them, who is normally understood to be an enemy of the mugging victim politically, instead picks them up, cares for them, takes them to an inn, and pays for them to be taken care of by the innkeeper, right? So they are going to go tell a tale of sacrifice and the importance and power of sacrifice to the incoming seminarians. So condition 1, they're given just a few minutes. What would happen is the confederate would deliberately step in front of the seminarian such that the seminarian would bump into them. The confederate would then drop a whole armful of papers. And they counted how many times the seminarians would stop and help in each condition. In the you're sprinting across campus condition, very few seminarians would stop to help. Okay, the person, gets knocked over, their papers go everywhere. The seminarian, I'm sorry, I got to go give this lecture, bye, and keep running across campus. If they walk fast, they can make it. A few more of them were stopping to help in that condition. In the 45-minute condition, where they had lots of time to go, most of them stopped and helped the person that they knocked over. So this is a tale of sacrifice. That for the seminarians that were in a hurry, it was a bigger sacrifice for them to stop and help. Now, here's something I would like you to consider. It wasn't just a sacrifice for the seminarians, okay? It was also a sacrifice for those people that they are going to teach about the Good Samaritan. And so what they did by stopping to help is they sacrificed their time that they needed to get across campus. And they sacrificed the time of the people waiting for them to come and give the lecture. So it's a conflict of sacrifice. Do they sacrifice helping this one person and then help the others waiting, the audience? Or do they miss helping the one person they ran into to help out this incoming class understand the importance of a Good Samaritan, right? So there are layers of irony and interpretation possible. It allows us, the story, to really meditate upon what sacrifice means in this simple study. So the highest level of compassion is sacrifice. That's when we are giving to another what they need that I also need, okay? So Levinas, and I hope we get to talk about Levinas in some of these future videos. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas talks about how it is that encountering the other, encountering them as human, what he called the face of the other. If we are hungry and we encounter the hunger of another, that it is like the bread is snatched from our own mouths, and we feel this obligation to care when we encounter another humanely like that. So the second highest level, is generosity. Generosity is when we provide care for another, and it's care that we can spare, right? It's care that we can, okay, I've got plenty of food in the fridge, you're hungry, make yourself a big old sandwich, right? I'm still being generous. I got plenty of food in the fridge for both you and I, right? So this is when you give somebody a few minutes of your time when you have time to spare. This is when you let somebody into traffic when you're really not in that big a hurry, right? Yes, you still want to get home. Yes, all of us sharing the condition of the traffic jam in common. That old adage, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic, right? So you generously let them in. Yes, you'll get home 30 seconds later than you otherwise would. However, it's 30 seconds, right? So that's generosity. Feeding people when you've got plenty of food or enough food to feed both of you. So the lowest level of care, this very lowest level, is kindness. I was listening to a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell. And in there, he talks about kindness is the temporary suspension of indifference. I just love the way he put that. The temporary suspension of indifference. And so that's when we, rather than treating one another objectively or impersonally, this is just those little moments every day where we just acknowledge someone else, smile at them, thank them, the basic social niceties that all of us were, or I think most of us were taught at least. Please and thank you, and those shoes look amazing, and thanks for coming here today. Thank you for listening to my video. Those basic little moments of acceptance, compassion, and gratitude, just the little ones. And if all of us did it regularly, this temporary suspension of indifference, I think our world would be a better place overall. So, living compassion. So, by way of review, first level is understanding what somebody else feels and then being motivated to help. Empathy plus motivation to help is compassion. To understand what other people feel, we get to ask them and appreciate it when they don't always know or when it's complex. We get to put ourselves in their shoes to the best of our abilities. How would we feel in that same situation? And then we get to return and ask, well, here's how I'd feel in that situation. How do you feel? Right? And then, of course, the 3 levels. The highest level of compassion is sacrifice. Really understanding what somebody else needs, and it's a needful thing to you too. And you sacrifice of yourself for the sake of the other. The lower level of that is generosity. I've got time or resources to spare, and so I'll give it to you generously, right? And then, of course, kindness is very important and foundational to the higher 2 levels, the temporary suspension of indifference, and just living the social niceties of manners, of gratitude, of acceptance, little acts of compassion. And I think this foundation level is also very important. So, thank you for joining me today on this episode about transformative relationships, particularly the part of compassion. And thank you again for hanging out with me today. And I hope to see you again on another episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D.